Can I work here?
All right, kid. Get inside.
Blood dripped from a 10-year-old's swollen chin onto the greasy asphalt outside the most notorious Hells Angels clubhouse in Nevada. Standing before heavily tattooed outlaws, he didn't flinch. He just looked at the towering chapter president and whispered, "Can I work here?" What happened next paralyzed an entire town. Dust hung heavy in the blistering August air of Rust Creek, a forgotten Nevada town where the only things that thrived were cheap liquor stores and secrets. At the dead end of Elm Street sat a compound surrounded by 10-foot chain-link fencing, topped with razor wire. Security cameras swept the perimeter like mechanical vultures. This was the local charter of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. To the townsfolk, it was a fortress of intimidation. To the men inside, it was a sanctuary. Thomas Bear Callahan, the chapter president, sat on a weathered wooden bench near the open bay doors of the garage. Bear was a mountain of a man, standing 6'4" with a braided gray beard, arms covered in ink, and a stare that had notoriously broken the spirit of rival gang members without him having to throw a single punch. Beside him, two of his enforcers, a wiry man named David and a mechanic known as Wrench Pete, were deep into rebuilding the transmission of a '98 Harley Davidson. The rumble of heavy machinery and the sharp scent of gasoline, sweat, and stale beer usually drowned out everything else. But that afternoon, something microscopic managed to cut through the heavy atmosphere. A shadow, barely large enough to register, fell across the sun-baked concrete just beyond the iron gates. Bear squinted through the heat distortion. Standing on the wrong side of the threshold was a boy. He couldn't have been older than 10. He wore a faded, oversized t-shirt that hung off his skeletal frame like a rag, and sneakers held together by silver duct tape. "Hey," David barked, dropping a socket wrench that clanged loudly against the floor. "Beat it, kid. You're in the wrong neighborhood." The boy didn't run. He didn't even blink. He took a deliberate step forward, pushing his way through the half-open pedestrian gate, entering the lion's den. As the kid stepped into the harsh sunlight, the bikers fell silent. The tough guy bravado vanished from Bear's face, replaced by a cold, hardened grimace. The left side of the boy's face was a horrifying canvas of deep purple and mottled yellow. His bottom lip was split, crusted with dried blood, and his left eye was swollen shut. He held his left arm tight against his ribs, favoring his side, as if every breath was a calculation of pain. Bear slowly rose from the bench. He tossed his cigarette onto the concrete, crushing it beneath a heavy leather boot. He walked toward the boy, blocking out the sun. "You lost, son?" Bear's voice was a low, gravelly rumble, surprisingly gentle for a man who looked like he chewed gravel for breakfast. The boy tilted his head back to meet Bear's eyes. "No, sir. I'm looking for a job." David let out a short, incredulous laugh, but a sharp, sideways glance from Bear shut him up instantly. "A job," Bear repeated, kneeling down so he was eye-level with the battered child. Up close, the bruising looked even worse. The fingerprints on the boy's neck were unmistakable. "What's your name?" "Leo," the boy answered, his voice barely a rasp. "Well, Leo, we don't hire kids, and we definitely don't hire kids who look like they just went 5 rounds with a freight train. Who did that to your face?" Leo's good eye darted toward the ground. The golden rule of abused children kicked in. "Never tell. I fell off my bike," he lied, his voice trembling for the first time. "I hit a curb." "That's a hell of a curb," Wrench Pete muttered from the background, wiping grease from his hands with a dirty rag. "Look," Leo said, his tiny fists clenching at his sides. "I know how to sweep. I can organize tools. I can wash the bikes. I'll do anything. I need money. Please." "I work hard." Bear stared at the kid. He knew exactly what he was looking at. Bear had grown up in a house where the walls had holes and the belts had brass buckles. He knew the desperate, frantic energy of a kid who needed cash to either run away or buy something to keep the monster at home happy. He also knew that a kid showing up at a Hells Angels clubhouse wasn't an accident. A child only seeks out the most dangerous men in town when they realize those men are the only ones scarier than the person waiting for them at home. "You touch one of these bikes without me telling you, I'll hang you by your shoelaces from the rafters, Bear said gruffly. He reached into his leather cut, pulled out a crisp $20 bill, and held it out. Take this, and go buy some ice for that face. Leo looked at the money, then stepped back, shaking his head. I don't take charity, I said. I want to work. The silence in the garage was deafening. David and Pete exchanged bewildered looks. Bear lowered his hand, a slow, genuine smirk creeping through his thick beard. He respected the pride. All right, Bear said, standing. Back up. Pete, give the kid a broom, $10 a day. You sweep the shop floor, you take out the trash, and you keep your mouth shut. You see anything, you hear anything, it stays in this garage. Understood? Yes, sir. Leo nodded emphatically, wincing as the movement pulled at his bruised neck. For the rest of the afternoon, the Hells Angels watched in quiet fascination as the tiny, battered boy meticulously swept every inch of the massive garage. He worked with a frantic, obsessive energy, sweeping up metal shavings, dirt, and cigarette butts until the concrete was spotless. He never complained. He never asked for a break. Every time one of the bikers walked past him, Leo would instinctively flinch, his shoulders rising to protect his head, before forcing himself to relax. When the sun began to dip below the Nevada mountains, casting long, blood-red shadows across the compound, Bear called the boy over. He handed him a $10 bill. Same time tomorrow, Leo? Bear asked. Leo tucked the bill safely into his sock. Yes, sir. Thank you. As the boy limped out of the gates and disappeared down the dusty road, David walked up next to Bear. You know we can't keep a kid around here, boss. We got business. We got heat from the local PD. If someone sees a kid hanging around a Hells Angels charter, Child Services will be swarming this place, bringing the cops right behind them. I know, Bear said, his eyes fixed on the empty road where Leo had vanished. But a kid doesn't get bruises like that from a curb. Someone is using that boy as a punching bag. Bear turned to David, his expression stone cold. Find out where he lives. Find out who's doing it. Over the next 3 weeks, Leo became a permanent fixture at the Hells Angels clubhouse. Every day, at 3:30 p.m., right after the school bell rang, he would slip through the iron gates, grab his broom, and get to work. The transformation within the garage was subtle but profound. The hardened outlaws, men who had spent their lives fighting rival gangs and dodging federal task forces, began to soften around the edges. Wrench Pete started leaving out ham sandwiches by accident on the workbench, knowing Leo would eat them. David, who normally communicated purely in grunts and threats, took 10 minutes one afternoon to show Leo the proper way to hold a wrench so he wouldn't strip a bolt. But Bear noticed the darker details. He noticed that Leo never ate the whole sandwich. He always wrapped half of it in paper towels and hid it in his pocket. He noticed that whenever a loud noise echoed through the shop, a backfiring engine or a dropped hammer, Leo would freeze in terror, his eyes wide, anticipating violence. And worse, he noticed that while the old bruises on Leo's face were fading to a sickly yellow, new ones were appearing. A fresh burn mark on his wrist, a limp that changed from his left leg to his right. The monster at home was still hungry. One Tuesday evening, rain lashed against the tin roof of the garage. Bear sat in his office, a cramped room smelling of cheap cigars and aged leather. The door opened, and David stepped inside, shaking water from his heavy jacket. His face was grim. I tailed the kid, David said, closing the door behind him and leaning against it. Followed him all the way to the edge of town, past the old lumber mill. He lives in that rundown trailer park off Route 9. Bear leaned forward, resting his elbows on his cluttered oak desk. And he lives with his mother, David continued, his voice dropping an octave. And his stepfather. Who is he? Bear demanded, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of the desk. Give me a name, David. David hesitated. In the 20 years Bear had known him, David had never hesitated to deliver bad news. He swallowed hard. It's Richard Sterling. Bear felt the air get sucked out of the room. He sat back in his chair, staring blankly at the wall. Richard Sterling wasn't just a local drunk or a nameless deadbeat. He was the deputy sheriff of Rust Creek. He was the golden boy of the local police department, a man who ran the youth baseball league and shook hands with the mayor at Sunday church services. More importantly to the Hells Angels, Deputy Sterling was the head of the newly formed anti-gang task force. He had spent the last 8 months aggressively trying to dismantle Bear's charter, pulling bikers over for busted taillights, raiding their affiliated bars, and desperately trying to find a reason to kick down the gates of their compound with a federal warrant. Sterling was untouchable. He was the law, and behind closed doors, he was beating a 10-year-old boy half to death. "Are you sure?" Bear asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "I sat in the tree line for 3 hours," David said, pulling up a chair. "I watched Sterling pull up in his squad car. He was stumbling, drunk out of his mind. Leo ran out to the porch to greet him. Sterling didn't even say a word. Just backhanded the kid so hard he flew off the porch into the mud. Then he dragged him inside by his hair. 10 minutes later, I heard the mother screaming, then just crying." Bear closed his eyes. The rage that boiled inside him was primal. The Hells Angels operated on a strict code of brotherhood and survival. You didn't invite police heat unless you absolutely had to. Going after a decorated deputy sheriff wasn't just poking the bear, it was strapping dynamite to the entire club. If a Hells Angel laid a finger on a cop, the ATF, the FBI, and the state troopers would wipe their charter off the map. They would all end up in federal prison. "We can't touch him, Bear," David said softly, reading his president's mind. "If we go after Sterling, the club is dead. We lose everything." "He's a cop," Bear growled, opening his eyes, a dark fire burning in his pupils. "Child services won't do a damn thing. His buddies on the force will cover it up. They always do. They'll bury the paperwork, and Sterling will just take his anger out on the kid for calling it in. If we don't do anything, David, that boy is going to end up in a pine box." "It's not our problem," David argued, stepping forward. "He's just a kid who sweeps our floors. You're talking about risking the freedom of 30 brothers for a stranger. Sterling is looking for an excuse to destroy us. If we cross this line, we hand him the weapon to do it." Bear stood up slowly. He walked over to the small window of his office that overlooked the dark, empty garage floor. In the corner, neatly propped against the wall, was Leo's broom. Next to it was a small pile of rusted bolts the boy had painstakingly organized that afternoon. Bear thought about the $20 Leo had refused on his first day. He thought about the half-eaten sandwiches saved for a starving mother. He thought about the absolute terror in the boy's eyes, and how, despite that terror, Leo still showed up every single day to work. "He came to us," Bear said quietly, pressing his forehead against the cold glass of the window. "He walked past the police station. He walked past the church, and he came to the Hells Angels. He asked us for a job because he knew we were the only ones who wouldn't be scared of the monster in his house." Bear turned to face David. The decision was made. The president of the charter was no longer looking at the situation as an outlaw trying to avoid prison. He was looking at it as a man. "Call the brothers," Bear commanded, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "Lock the gates. Cut the cameras. Tonight, we don't ride for the club. We ride for Leo." David stared at Bear for a long, heavy moment. He knew the gravity of the order. He knew this could be the end of their charter, the end of their lives as free men. But as David looked into Bear's eyes, he slowly nodded. He pulled his leather cut tight over his chest. "I'll get the boys," David said, pulling open the door. "What's the play, boss?" Bear walked over to his desk and pulled open the bottom drawer. He didn't reach for his gun, nor did he reach for his brass knuckles. Instead, he pulled out a thick, leather-bound notebook and a digital camera. "We don't just kill him," Bear said, a cold, calculated smile forming on his lips. "If we kill him, he becomes a martyr, a hero cop, struck down by evil bikers. No, we're going to do something much worse, David. We're going to tear down his entire life, piece by piece, and we're going to let the whole town watch." The heavy steel bay doors of the Hells Angels clubhouse slammed shut, sealing 32 patched members inside the cavernous garage. The usual scent of cheap beer and motor oil was overshadowed by a thick, suffocating tension. Under the harsh glare of the overhead fluorescent lights, Bear stood at the head of a massive oak table, looking out at his brothers. These were men forged in violence, men who knew the inside of a cell better than the inside of a church. Yet, As Bear laid out the truth about the little boy who swept their floors, the room went dead silent. "We all know the code," Bear began, his voice a low, commanding rumble that echoed off the cinder block walls. "We handle our own. We don't invite the law to our doorstep. But what's happening in that trailer park isn't the law. It's a slaughter, and it's being carried out by a man wearing a tin star." A hulking biker named Boone, scarred and missing half his left ear, crossed his massive arms. "Bear, if we take out a deputy, the feds will scorch this earth. We'll all hang. We're outlaws, not vigilantes. We aren't going to take him out," Bear replied, slamming his hand flat against the table. "I said we are going to dismantle him. Sterling thinks his badge makes him a god in Rust Creek. He thinks it hides his sins. We are going to rip that badge off his chest and expose the devil underneath. But we need proof. Ironclad, undeniable proof that his buddies down at the precinct can't shred." For the next 2 weeks, the Hells Angels transformed from a motorcycle club into a highly synchronized intelligence unit. They knew how to evade the police. Now, they were hunting one. David and a tech-savvy prospect named Wyatt took the first watch. They parked a rusted, unmarked panel van 2 blocks from the trailer park, running high-directional microphones and long-lens cameras. Wrench Pete, who had spent a few years laying cable before patching into the club, used his expertise to tap into the local telecommunications relay. They quickly learned Richard Sterling's routines. He drank heavily at a dive bar called the Rusty Anchor until 11 p.m., drove his cruiser home drunk, and took his miserable life out on his wife and stepson. But watching from afar wasn't enough to get the evidence they needed to sink a decorated cop. They needed eyes inside the house. The opportunity came on a sweltering Friday night. Sterling had been called out to a multi-car pileup on the interstate, pulling every available unit out of Rust Creek proper. His wife, broken and exhausted, worked the night shift at the local diner, leaving Leo home alone. Under the cover of a moonless sky, Bear and Wyatt slipped over the chain-link fence at the back of the trailer park. They moved like ghosts through the overgrown weeds, approaching the battered single-wide trailer. Bear knocked softly on the aluminum door. "Leo, it's Bear." The door creaked open just an inch. The boy's eye peered through the crack, widening in shock. He quickly unlatched the chain and pulled the door open. He looked even worse than the first day he had arrived at the gates. A fresh, jagged cut marked his cheekbone. "What are you doing here?" Leo whispered frantically, glancing toward the road. "If he catches you here, he'll kill me." "He's not coming back for hours, son," Bear said gently, placing a massive, calloused hand on the boy's trembling shoulder. "We're here to stop him. For good. But we need your help." Wyatt stepped inside, pulling 3 tiny, pinhole cameras from his leather jacket. "Where does he hit you, Leo? Where does it usually happen?" Tears welled up in Leo's eyes, but he swallowed hard, pointing a shaky finger toward the cramped living room and the narrow hallway. "There. He usually sits in that recliner. When he gets mad, he throws me against the wall." In less than 10 minutes, Wyatt had the cameras wired seamlessly into the trailer's smoke detector, the television bezel, and a vent above the hallway. They were motion-activated and transmitted directly to the hard drive sitting in Bear's office. "You did good, kid," Bear said, crouching down to look Leo in the eye. "Now listen to me. Tomorrow, when he starts yelling, do not fight back. Just cover your head. Let the cameras do the work. We will be right outside. I promise you on my life, Leo. Tomorrow is the last time he ever lays a hand on you." Leo nodded, wiping a tear from his bruised cheek. For the first time in his young life, he felt something entirely foreign. He felt protected. For the next 48 hours, the men inside the clubhouse watched the feeds in agonizing silence. They watched Sterling stumble through the door, spewing venom at his wife. They watched him hurl a beer bottle at the wall, inches from Leo's head. The outlaws gripped the edges of Bear's desk, their knuckles white, jaws clenched so hard their teeth ached. Every instinct screamed at them to ride down there and tear the man limb from limb. Then, on Sunday evening, it happened. Sterling was furious. The mayor had reprimanded him for a botched drug bust. Drunk and humiliated, the deputy walked into the trailer and locked his eyes directly on Leo, who was quietly trying to do his math homework at the kitchen table. You think you're smart, you little parasite? Sterling slurred, his face flushed with rage. He lunged across the room, grabbing Leo by the collar of his t-shirt and lifting him completely off the floor. In the clubhouse, Bear didn't hesitate. He smashed his fist onto the desk. "Saddle up!" Bear roared, his voice shaking the foundation of the room. "We move!" Now. The rumble began as a low vibration in the pavement, a distant thunder that rolled through the desolate streets of Rust Creek. Within minutes, the sound exploded into an earth-shattering roar. 30 heavily customized Harley-Davidsons tore down Route 9, moving in a flawless, V-shaped formation. Leading the pack was Bear, his face a mask of absolute, unyielding fury. In the trailer, Sterling had just thrown Leo to the floor, unbuckling his heavy leather belt. He raised his hand, ready to bring it down across the boy's back, when the walls of the trailer began to vibrate. The glass in the windows rattled. The cheap picture frames on the walls shook loose and shattered on the linoleum. Sterling froze, the belt dangling from his hand. He stumbled toward the window and tore back the cheap plastic blinds. His blood ran cold. Surrounding the entire perimeter of his lot were 30 Hells Angels. Their high-beam headlights flooded the trailer in a blinding, terrifying white glare. The collective roar of their engines was deafening, a mechanical scream of pure intimidation. They weren't moving, they weren't shouting. They were just sitting on their bikes, staring directly at his front door. "What the hell?" Sterling muttered, his drunken haze instantly vanishing, replaced by a cold spike of adrenaline. He dropped the belt and instinctively grabbed his service weapon from the kitchen counter. He kicked the front door open and stepped onto the small wooden porch, aiming his Glock squarely at Bear's chest. "Back off!" Sterling screamed over the engines, flashing his badge with his free hand. "This is private property. I am a sworn officer of the law. I will drop every single one of you animals." Bear slowly kicked the stand down on his bike. He killed his engine. One by one, in perfect synchronization, the other 29 bikers cut their engines. The sudden, dead silence that fell over the property was vastly more terrifying than the noise. Bear dismounted his bike. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't even raise his hands. He just walked slowly toward the porch, his heavy boots crunching against the gravel. "Stop right there, Callahan!" Sterling yelled, his hands shaking as he kept the gun leveled at Bear's head. "I will shoot you dead, and the law will pin a medal on my chest for it." "Put the gun down, Richard," Bear said calmly, stopping 10 feet from the porch. "You aren't going to shoot anyone tonight, unless you want to spend the rest of your miserable life in a federal penitentiary." Sterling let out a panicked, breathless laugh. "You think you can threaten a cop? You're a thug. I'm the law." "You're right," Bear nodded slowly, reaching into his leather cut. Sterling tightened his grip on his gun, ready to fire. But Bear pulled out a thick manila envelope and a small digital tablet. He tossed them both onto the wooden planks of the porch. "You are the law," Bear said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "But you see, Richard, we live in a digital age." Sterling cautiously lowered his gun slightly, glancing down at the tablet. The screen was lit up. It was paused on a high-definition frame. It was an image of himself, violently grabbing Leo by the throat, taken just 10 minutes prior from inside his own home. The deputy's face drained of all color. He felt the air leave his lungs. "We have over 40 hours of footage," Bear continued, his voice echoing in the dead silence of the night. "High-definition video, crisp audio. We've got you beating a 10-year-old boy. We've got you striking your wife. We've got you snorting cocaine off your kitchen table while in uniform, bragging about skimming cash from the evidence locker." Sterling stumbled back, dropping his gun to his side as if it had turned to lead. "How? How did you—" "That envelope," Bear pointed a massive, tattooed finger at the manila folder, "contains flash drives. 50 of them. Right now, as we speak, my boys are delivering those drives to the state police headquarters in Carson City. They are being slipped under the door of the FBI field office. They are being emailed to every major news station in Nevada. And just for good measure, Wrench Pete hacked the town's emergency broadcast server. He's currently projecting that video onto the side of the mayor's office right in the town square." Sterling collapsed onto his knees, dropping his badge onto the porch. He put his hands over his face. a pathetic, sobbing noise escaping his throat. His entire life, his career, his false image, it was completely annihilated in the span of 3 minutes. Bear stepped up onto the porch, towering over the broken cop. The door to the trailer slowly opened, and Leo stood in the threshold, clutching his injured arm, his eyes wide as he looked at the army of bikers in his yard. Bear knelt down, ignoring the sobbing deputy, and looked at the boy. "Get your things, Leo," Bear said softly, handing the boy his $20 bill from that very first day. "You don't live here anymore." The wail of sirens pierced the quiet Nevada night long before the flashing red and blue lights painted the walls of the trailer park. They weren't the familiar, sluggish sirens of the Rust Creek local precinct. These were the high-pitched, aggressive shrieks of the Nevada State Police. Wrench Pete's digital assault had worked perfectly. By broadcasting the deputy's atrocities to every state agency and news outlet simultaneously, the local cops were entirely cut out of the loop. There would be no sweeping this under the rug. Sterling remained on his knees in the dirt, the manila envelope lying before him like a tombstone. As 3 state cruiser SUVs tore into the dirt lot, kicking up clouds of dust, the Hells Angels didn't scatter. They didn't even flinch. They remained perfectly still, a wall of leather and steel, ensuring the rat couldn't scurry away. State troopers swarmed the yard, assault rifles raised, shouting commands. The tension was a living thing, thick enough to choke on. A single misinterpretation, a single sudden movement, and the trailer park would become a war zone. "Stand down! Hands where I can see them!" a state police captain bellowed, stepping out of the lead vehicle. He recognized the heavy braided beard and imposing frame of Thomas Bear Callahan instantly. "Callahan? What the hell are you doing here?" Bear didn't raise his hands. He simply pointed down at the sobbing deputy at his feet. "We're making a citizen's arrest, Captain. I believe you've checked your email in the last 10 minutes? The captain looked from Bear to Sterling, disgust washing over his hardened features. He motioned to his men. 2 troopers holstered their weapons, marched onto the porch, and violently yanked Sterling to his feet. As the cold steel handcuffs ratcheted tightly around Sterling's wrists, the deputy didn't say a word. The arrogance had been completely bled out of him. He was shoved into the back of a cruiser, a broken man heading toward a prison system where former cops rarely survived their first year. From the dark interior of the trailer, Leo's mother, Sarah, emerged. She was trembling uncontrollably, clutching a battered duffel bag in one hand and Leo's shoulder with the other. She stared at the 30 outlaws surrounding her home. For years, she had been told by her husband that these men were the scum of the earth, monsters who would destroy her family if given the chance. Yet, as she looked at Bear, all she saw was salvation. Is he really gone?" Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. "He's gone, ma'am," Bear said, his tone softening dramatically. "He's never coming back. You have my word." The state troopers cordoned off the area, but the captain walked up to Bear, keeping his voice low. "You took a massive risk tonight, Callahan. You put a target on your charter's back to take down a dirty badge. Why?" Bear looked past the captain, his eyes locking onto Leo, who was holding the $20 bill tightly in his small fist. "Because the law was blind, Captain, and the kid needed a job." With a sharp whistle from Bear, the 30 heavy engines roared to life in unison. The Hells Angels backed their bikes out of the lot, leaving the flashing lights and the shattered remnants of Deputy Sterling's life in their rearview mirrors. The fallout in Rust Creek was biblical. The morning news stations ran Wrench Pete's intercepted footage on a continuous loop. The mayor was forced into an emergency press conference, sweating profusely as he announced the immediate disbandment of the anti-gang task force and a full internal investigation into the Rust Creek Police Department. Richard Sterling was denied bail, facing 30 counts of aggravated assault, corruption, and child abuse. The town's golden boy was a monster, and the town's monsters were the ones who had slain him. 2 days later, the atmosphere inside the Hells Angels clubhouse was surprisingly quiet. The bay doors were open, letting in the warm afternoon breeze. Leo was back, sweeping the floor near David's workstation, his limp already noticeably better. Bear sat in his office, pouring a heavy measure of bourbon into a glass, when a knock at the door interrupted him. It was Sarah. She looked entirely different. The hollow, terrified look in her eyes had been replaced by a cautious spark of life. She walked into the office, holding a small, faded cigar box. "I came to thank you, Mr. Callahan," Sarah said, sitting in the heavy leather chair opposite his desk. "The state police relocated us to a safe house in Carson City. We're starting over. But before we leave, I needed to show you this." She slid the cigar box across the desk. Bear set his drink down and popped the brass latch. Inside rested a heavy, silver chain with a tarnished pendant and a stack of Polaroid photographs. Bear picked up the top photograph, and his blood ran cold. It was a picture of a much younger Sarah, smiling brightly, sitting on the back of a customized 1980 Harley-Davidson shovelhead. Sitting in front of her, wearing the iconic Death's Head patch of the Hells Angels, was a man Bear recognized instantly. "My God," Bear breathed, leaning back in his chair. "That's Tommy Maddox." "Crazy Tommy," Sarah smiled sadly. "My husband." Bear's mind spun. Tommy Maddox wasn't just a Hells Angel. He was a legend. He was a founding member of the Oakland Charter, a man who had ridden alongside Ralph "Sonny" Barger. Maddox was a ghost story they told. Prospects around the fire, a man who lived and died fiercely by the club's code before perishing in a horrific highway crash 12 years ago. "Leo is Tommy's son," Sarah confessed quietly. "Richard Sterling was a rookie cop in Oakland back then. Tommy humiliated him during a bar raid. Made a fool of him in front of his entire precinct. Sterling never forgot it. When Tommy died, Sterling found me. He played the grieving friend, manipulated me, and moved us out here to Rust Creek where he had power." Bear stared at the photograph, the puzzle pieces violently slamming into place. Sterling wasn't just a drunk who liked to hit kids. He was torturing Leo because of his bloodline. He was taking his revenge on an Oakland Hells Angel, who was already dead. Sterling hated him because Leo looks exactly like his father. Sarah wiped a tear from her cheek. "I never told Leo. I wanted to protect him from the life. But when things got bad, when Leo realized he needed help, he didn't go to the police. He didn't go to the teachers. He walked directly to your gates. It's in his blood, Mr. Callahan. He belongs to the Brotherhood." Bear stood up, taking the silver chain from the box. Attached to it was Tommy Maddox's original silver ring, stamped with the letters AFA Angels. Forever, forever, Angels. Bear walked out of his office, descending the metal stairs to the garage floor. The heavy clanking of tools stopped as the brothers noticed the serious look on their president's face. Bear walked straight over to Leo, who immediately stopped sweeping and stood at attention. Bear knelt down in front of the boy. The heavy purple bruising on Leo's face had faded to a dull yellow. The fear that used to paralyze his posture was completely gone. "Your mother told me you're moving to Carson City," Bear said, his gravelly voice echoing in the silent garage. Leo looked down at his shoes. "Yes, sir. I guess this is my last shift." "No, it's not," Bear replied. He reached out and draped the heavy silver chain around Leo's neck. The heavy ring rested perfectly against the boy's chest. "A man's shift isn't over until his brothers say it is." Leo looked down at the ring, his eyes wide with awe, before looking back up at Bear. "What is this?" "It belonged to your father, Leo," Bear said, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "He was one of the greatest men to ever wear our patch. You have his blood in your veins. That means you aren't just a kid looking for a job anymore. You're family. And family doesn't get left behind." Bear stood up and looked around the garage at his men. David, Wrench Pete, Boone, and the rest of the hardened outlaws all nodded in silent agreement. They understood the gravity of the moment. The kid sweeping their floors was legacy. "We're opening a new charter in Carson City," Bear announced to the room, though his eyes never left Leo. "Wrench Pete is going to need an apprentice to help set up the shop. The pay is $20 a day, and nobody, no cop, no teacher, no man on this earth will ever lay a hand on you again. Do we have a deal?" Leo looked around the room at the towering, tattooed men who had saved his life. He felt the heavy silver ring resting against his heart. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel small. He didn't feel bruised. He felt invincible. A slow, confident smile broke across Leo's face. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small, folded piece of paper, and handed it to Wrench Pete. It was a schematic he had drawn of a carburetor. "I'll take the job," Leo said, his voice steady and strong. "But I think I'm ready to stop sweeping. I want to build." Bear laughed, a deep, booming sound that filled the garage, wrapping the boy in the protective roar of the Hells Angels. The town of Rust Creek had tried to break a little boy, but all they had done was forge the next generation of outlaw. If this story of the Hells Angels delivering street justice and protecting the innocent gave you chills, hit that like button and share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible true-life stories of outlaws, heroes, and the wild twists in between. Ring the bell so you never miss a video, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below.
Hi, my name is Dominant Flame Esco, the owner and manager of Dominant Flame Esco. After watching the video, Boy with Bruised Face asked bikers, "Can I work here? What happened next shook the whole town. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel?" What stayed with me most was the feeling of vulnerability behind such a simple question. A kid showing up bruised and asking for work instead of help says a lot about what he may have already been through. That's what gave the story its emotional weight for me. Sometimes people who seem tough on the outside can still recognize pain immediately, especially when they see it in someone younger and defenseless. Do you think the bikers saw part of themselves in that boy, or was it simply impossible for them to ignore what was happening to him? And why do you think kindness from unexpected people often leaves the strongest impression? I think stories like this remind us that support and protection can come from places we least expect, and that paying attention to someone struggling can truly matter. If this story stayed with you emotionally, I'd really love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy biker stories filled with loyalty, heart, and unexpected human connection, feel free to like and subscribe only if you'd like to see more.